Hello good people, today we're taking a look at The Division 2. How does it perform on older and new-ish hardware? Can you play it on low-end hardware? First off, the game, when released, will have a built-in benchmark tool, but for this private beta that was not available, so I had to find my own spot to benchmark. You will see where I tested on the screen now. I started at a red car and ran down the road and stopped in front of a police car. Each run took around 30 seconds and all runs were made during the day in sunny weather. The numbers on the graphs will be the average of 3 runs. Let's start by looking at the specs of the different systems. First off is the system tested with the GTX 1070 and R9 290. Here we have a Ryzen 1600 at 3.7 GHz with 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory, an i5 6600K at 4.8 GHz also with 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory, an FX8350 at 4.5 GHz with 16 GB of 1600 MHz DDR3 memory, and lastly a Phenom II X6 1090T at 3.8 GHz with 16 GB of 1600 MHz DDR3 memory. We also have the low-end system with a Pentium G4620 at 3.7 GHz and i5 6600K also at 3.7 GHz, both with the GTX 1050 and 8 GB of 2400 MHz DDR4 memory. I tested both DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. We start off by looking at the graphs for the DirectX 11 test with the R9 290 and GTX 1070. Here we can see the i5 6600K topping the chart with the 1070 with an average score of 62.3 frames per second, a 1% low of 39.4 frames per second, and 0.1% low of 33.2 frames per second. On its heels are the R5 1600, which managed an average of 58 frames per second with a 1% low of 35.6 frames per second, 0.1% low of 24 frames per second. In third place, we find the FX8350 with an average of 50.3 frames per second, with a 1% low of 32.7 frames per second and 0.1% low of 20.3 frames per second. In last place is the Phenom II X6 1090T with an average of 41.4 frames per second, a 1% low of 26.6 frames per second and 0.1% low of 22.7 frames per second. Quite a bottleneck. Right behind the Phenom 2 paired with the 1070, we find the R9 290 with the i5 6600K with an average score of 35.8 frames per second, a 1% low of 21.1 frames per second and 0.1% low of 18.4 frames per second. The i5 is dipping quite low with the R9 290. The R5 1600 does a bit better with a 1% low of 28.8 frames per second and 0.1% low of 26.3 frames per second. The average is pretty much the same as the i5 6600K at 35.7 frames per second. The FX8350 puts on a decent show with the R9 290 when compared with the others. Manage an average of 33.9 frames per second with a 1% low of 24.5 frames per second and 0.1% low of 21.2 frames per second. The lowest beating out the i5 there. Last place goes to the Phenom 1090T with an average of 27.4 frames per second, a 1% low of 18.7 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 16.2 frames per second. In other words, pretty much unplayable in my opinion. Moving on to the DirectX 12 numbers. Here the R5 1600 and 1070 takes the lead with an average of 70 frames per second, a 1% low of 44.7 frames per second and 0.1% low of 37.2 frames per second. The i5 6600K lags behind with 65.2 frames per second, a 1% low of 36.7 frames per second and the 0.1% low dipping under 30 frames per second. In third place we find the FX8350 with an average of 51.6 frames per second, a 1% low of 29.4 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 23 frames per second. In last place we find the Phenom II 1090T with an average of 42 frames per second, a 1% low of 23 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 17.5 frames per second. DirectX 12 did not help out the Phenom much. In fact, all CPUs saw a higher utilization when running DirectX 12. DirectX 12 did, however, help out the R9 290 quite a bit. Topping the chart is the R5 1600 again with an average of 44.4 frames per second, a 1% low of 34.5 frames per second, and 0.1% low of 30.6 frames per second. Right behind we find the i5 6600K with an average of 43.5 frames per second, a 1% low of 31.9 frames per second, and 0.1% low of 29 frames per second. As usual, we find the FX8350 in third place with an average score of 41.7 frames per second, a 1% low of 30.8 frames per second, and 0.1% low of 27.9 frames per second. The Phenom 1090T performed almost identically with an average of 41.6 frames per second, a 1% low of 26.6 frames per second, and 0.1% low of 22.7 frames per second. Looking at the chart, we can see that the Phenom is offering up the same performance with the two graphics cards, indicating that this is as much frames as it can push out in the Division 2. Before we move on to the low-end benchmarks, I want to mention, while looking at the chart, the i5 6600K seems to be doing okay. However, when gaming and chatting using Discord, the CPU shows its limits. Every time the CPU hits 100% utilization, which is quite often in this game, the audio going to and from Discord is cut, making it quite hard to coordinate with teammates. And it seems that 4 cores is at its limits these days. Now let's see how a GTX 1050 fares in the Division 2. I had to drop down to low settings to get a decent experience, and even then it would struggle at times. First up is the DirectX 11 numbers. The Pentium G4620 had a really hard time in DirectX 11, causing some serious stuttering. The average is a decent 60.2 frames per second, but the 1% and 0.1% low is a stunningly low 1.7 frames per second. Switching to the i5 6600K with 4 proper cores helps pushing the average to 63.8 frames per second with a 1% low of 38.2 frames per second and 0.1% low of 17.6 frames per second. Much better, but still some stuttering. Moving on to DirectX 12, the Pentium G4620 saw a much lower average at 48.8 frames per second, but the 1% were a much better, but still not good, 23.5 frames per second, and 0.1% low were 18.5 frames per second. The i5 6600K managed to squeeze out a couple of more frames than with the DirectX 11. The average is 67.7 frames per second with a 1% low of 36.9 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 24 frames per second. Even here, the i5 6600K saw 100% utilization quite often. Well, that was all the numbers I had for you this time. The next game out is Apex Legends, and that video will go out early next week. Thank you for watching, and remember, don't call tech support.